Today's Old Testament reading comes from Psalms 105, verse 16 to 24. He called for a famine on the land of Canaan, cutting off its food supply. Then he sent someone into Egypt ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with fetters and placed his neck in an iron collar. Until the time came to fulfill his dreams, the Lord tested Joseph's character. Then Pharaoh sent for him and set him free. The ruler of the nation opened his prison door. Joseph was put in charge of all the king's household and became ruler over all the king's possessions. He could instruct the king's aides as he pleased and teach the king's advisors. Then Israel arrived in Egypt. Jacob lived as a foreigner in the land of Ham. And the Lord multiplied the people of Israel until they became too mighty for their enemies. The epistle reading comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17 to 24. Each of you should continue to live in whichever situation the Lord has placed you, and remain as you were when God first called you. This is my rule for all the churches. For instance, a man who was circumcised before he became a believer should not try to reverse it, and a man who was uncircumcised when he became a believer should not be circumcised now. For it makes no difference whether a man has been circumcised. The important thing is to keep God's commandments. Yes, each of you should remain as you were when God called you. Are you a slave? Don't let that worry you. But if you get a chance to be free, take it. And remember, if you were a slave when the Lord called you, you are now free in the Lord. And if you were free when the Lord called you, you are now a slave of Christ. God paid a high price for you, so don't be enslaved by this world. Each of you, dear brothers and sisters, should remain as you were when God first called you. This is the word of God for the people of God.
After many years, I figured out why people wear shamrocks on St. Patrick's Day. People wear shamrocks because regular rocks are too heavy. And, yes, as we think about shamrocks, think of the four-leaf clover as throughout this message we consider four slaves of God, four servants of the Lord. And they will remind us of this. As Christians today, we need to remember that we can make a difference in people's lives. We need to remember that when we do God's will, we might even make history. The first slave we'll think about was the Old Testament's Joseph that you heard about in the Old Testament reading this morning. Who would have thought Joseph of the Old Testament would have made such a difference? His brothers hated him so much they stopped just short of killing him. He was not only a stranger in the land of Egypt, he was a slave there. Yet, as noted in this morning's Old Testament reading, because he did God's will, he became a great and influential person over the Egyptians, and eventually Joseph's people, the Israelites, triumphed over the Egyptians by escaping from slavery in that strange and foreign land. All this happened because Joseph went from being a slave to being a slave to God. The Apostle Paul, while he was never literally a slave, Paul was enslaved to human traditions when he helped persecute and even kill Christians. Seeing the risen Christ turned his life around, and Paul became a slave to God, which is the only way to know true freedom. So Paul reminds us in this morning's epistle reading not to be slaves to anybody or anything, but God especially, not to be slaves to sinfulness, because you were bought with a price, the price being Christ's blood, Christ's life. And history has been changed so powerfully by these two that even those who don't believe in Jesus or don't even believe in God would almost certainly agree that Joseph and the Apostle Paul made history and changed history. So as believers and followers of Jesus, we would be negligent if we forget that. The third slave this morning, Maywin, his birth name, Maywin. And his story is a story of a Christian who changed history after he escaped slavery in a strange and foreign land. Maywin was born in western Britain around 390. His dad was a tax collector for the Romans. His grandfather was a monk. And Maywin was raised as a Christian. The Irish King Niall often sent raids to England to kidnap people to make them slaves. Maywin was kidnapped in one of these raids when he was around 16 years old. He was captured and taken to Ireland as a slave, forced to herd cattle. He performed his duties with skill and honor. He prayed constantly to the Christian God, even in the midst of the non-Christian Irish. His life was lonely and incredibly difficult, but he loved the Irish countryside. Maywin took to calling himself by a Roman name, Patricius. After 6 years of horrible slavery, Patricius escaped by hiding on a ship. After returning to Europe, Patricius learned Latin and became an ordained priest. Someone appointed Patricius Bishop of the Irish, almost certainly because Patricius had lived there, knew more about the land and the people than any other priest alive. Patricius probably had mixed feelings about his appointment to Ireland. His 6 years of slavery in Ireland were hideous, but he loved the land there. The people of Ireland were at that time savage in the eyes of other Europeans. Their language and customs were foreign. The island of Ireland was far from the civilization of continental Europe. Of his calling to Ireland, though, Patricius, who was a mystic, wrote, "I saw in the bosom of the night a man coming, as it were, from Ireland, with letters. And he gave one of them to me, and I read the beginning of the letter containing the voice of the Irish. And they cried out then, as if with one voice, 'We entreat you, holy youth, that you come and henceafter walk among us.'" Patricius made some mistakes, but for the most part, he was very successful. Though his life was in constant danger, he baptized thousands. He established monasteries from one end of Ireland to the other, and eventually almost everyone on the whole island went from being a Druid to being a Christian. The Apostle of Ireland died in 461 on March 17th. The story of St. Patrick converting the Irish people to Christianity, leading to thousands, and then with their children, millions of people being Christians. That's very important right there. That's more than just a happy little tale. But that's not the end of the story. That's only the beginning. Now, as the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages continued, continental Europe was in terrible shape. There were invaders, there were wars, there were plagues, there were famines. On the continent of Europe, the teachings of the ancient Greeks were almost completely lost. Centuries earlier, the great library of Alexandria in Egypt, the librarian Alexandria had maps of the constellation, the works of philosophy, sciences, mathematics, burial rituals, all of that. The librarian Alexandria had almost all the knowledge of the ancient Western world, especially from Greece. It had from the African civilizations. It had some from Asia. But 48 BC, the great library of Alexandria burned to the ground, and all of that was lost. So the knowledge then of the great African civilization, some from Asia, from Europe, especially the ancient Greeks, it was the basis of Western civilization. All of that was in Europe. But now Europe was having really hard times, and those books and that knowledge was in danger. Where was all the knowledge of the ancient Greeks, the rest of it, the basis of what we know for Western civilization, kept safe, kept alive? After the Irish became Christians, the church gave them the task, because they were far away from the problems of continental Europe, of keeping records of the Bible, the early church writings, biblical scholars, church history, writings of the ancient Greeks, ancient African civilizations, Asia, especially math, science, philosophy, democracy, all of this knowledge. The Irish loved this task. They loved connecting knowledge. They became the world's greatest librarians. And Irish monks often defended these books against Viking invaders with their lives. Now, many invaders settled there later, giving the Irish their red hair. But first, the invaders came to destroy and steal, to pillage and plunder. We have the teachings of the ancients today because Irish Christians took care of those books, defended those books, sometimes with their lives. And yes, there were Irish warrior monks. That sounds like something out of fiction, but there were Irish warrior monks. There are writers who claim that in the Star Wars movies, the Jedi, the Order of the Jedi, and the Jedi Knights are patterned after the Irish warrior monks. Now, the lightsabers, that's more like the samurai. But as to how they were structured and what they did, the Star Wars Jedi, many claim, were patterned after the Irish warrior monks. And don't know if that's true, but I think it is, because in the Star Wars movie, The Force Awakens, they find the old Luke Skywalker on this little island. And there's the old Luke Skywalker with his long beard. Where did they shoot those scenes? They shot those scenes on the island of Skellig Michael off the coast of Ireland. That was one of the islands where the Irish monks fought and died to keep those books safe from the invaders. So yes, I think the Star Wars connection is real, but they really were Irish warrior monks, and they kept those books from being destroyed. And if they hadn't, maybe the writings of the ancients wouldn't have been rediscovered until 100, 200 years later. Maybe they would have been lost forever. The idea of democracy as we know it might not exist today, or might be very diminished, or might not have started until the 1800s or even the 1900s. If the Greek idea of science and their discoveries were rediscovered much later, maybe weren't rediscovered at all, would we have penicillin or antibiotics by now? Maybe the automobile wouldn't have been invented until around 1950. How many of us would be alive here today if medicine were maybe 100 years behind what it is? What we call Western civilization wouldn't exist, at least not as advanced as it is, without the Irish keeping those records safe and alive, often at the cost of their lives. And the Irish would never have done that. They wouldn't have cared unless the church could have handed the records over to them, which could never have happened unless the Irish had been Christians. And St. Patrick was the one who centuries earlier converted the Irish so well because, again, at that time, only one Christian clergy person on the whole planet knew the land, knew the people, knew the language, knew the custom. St. Patrick never drove the snakes out of Ireland because there never were any snakes in Ireland. But what he did was 1,000,000 times more important than that. So when you think about St. Patrick's, don't just think about leprechauns and four-leaf clovers and funny hats. Think about antibiotics and automobiles and spaceships. Think about science and math and democracy. None of those would be what they are today if it weren't for St. Patrick converting the Irish, and then the Irish keeping the great knowledge of Western civilization safe, while continental Europe had the fights, the frights, and the fires. So there's Sonia Massey's The Complete Idiot's Guide to Irish History and Culture, and Thomas Cahill's book. To me, the title is not an exaggeration, How the Irish Saved Civilization. Joseph in the Old Testament changed history, became God's slave. The Apostle Paul considered himself a slave to God, changed history. The slave boy Maywin became patricius, became God's slave and changed history, remembered every March 17th. So I like St. Patrick's Day a lot. It's fun. What really, really bothers me, what I really, really, really don't like is this idea out there. The Irish are jovial, silly little people who aren't very bright and are probably alcoholics. All of that is out there, and all of that to me is just obscene. The Irish and Scottish have given the world many great engineers, scientists, inventors, writers. That's another book and another sermon. But the Irish also kept safe the important writings of Western civilization. God is at work in history. Not just that the Irish saved civilization, we can think of that as the Christians saved civilization. Who were the ones that kept the math, the science, democracy, philosophy, all of that safe, all of that alive? They were Christians. And that's why we have civilization and science as we have today. But I mentioned 4 slaves. That's only 3. The 4th servant of the Lord is you. Now you say, well, I can't do anything that would change history. Well, what if Joseph or Paul or St. Patrick had said that? What if Daniel or Deborah or David had said that and believed it? History isn't made just by a handful of so-called great people who are so different from the rest of us. History is made by people, and all of us can be part of God's work in ways big and small. Think about that on March 17th, and remember how all that was preserved, democracy, philosophy, science, mathematics, maps, all of that was preserved in Ireland by the Christians who saw themselves doing God's work, the influence of Jesus and his servants, the influence of the people who said to Jesus, "Where you go, I will follow." Please give your attention at this time to our praise team as we continue with our ending song for this morning.